Hi, my name is James Vanatakis. I want to talk a little bit about my research area and also I want to talk about my research methodology, which is, I suppose, the main reason why you're watching this. My research area was looking at mostly around social movements. At the time I was researching, there was a lot of discussion around the shape of globalisation and where globalisation was going. And I was interested in the different social movements that were appearing around the world and what counter-narrative they were providing. So one of the things that I decided to do was not just sort of read their literature or watch interviews, it was actually to embed myself in those social movements, be part of those social movements and see what they were doing, trying to get the inside feeling for what they were doing, be part of conversations, be part of meetings. Now, as this happened, I also became a really passionate supporter of those movements. So I actually ended up employing a research methodology which I suppose the closest way to think about it was action research or participatory research. So I was actually participating in the organisations I was researching. So a lot of it was actually doing a bit of included self-critique, like seeing just exactly where I was going. So that's the sort of the thrust of sort of the research methodology I employed. It involved lots of recording of meetings, self-reflections, lots of qualitative research, lots of talking to people, but just being participating, and I suppose that's why we call it participatory research, participating in the action that was happening, which took me to all sorts of places. So I want to talk about those, but before I do, I want to give you a little bit of background about exactly what I was doing. So, my research. So, as I said, I was interested in the different social movements that were appearing around the world. And so, what I was looking for was an intellectual thread that brought them together. And I read this book, it wasn't a particularly great book, but it was called One No, Many Yeses. And what it sort of argued was that the social movements that were appearing around the world at the time were actually heterogeneous, and there was no real one theme that combined them. But I got a sense that there was a theme, there was something that could have united them. And so I ended up doing all sorts of things. I went to Amsterdam and sort of spent time with social movements there that were reclaiming land that wasn't used, and setting up squats. I spent some time in Melbourne where I spent time with an organisation that was reclaiming disused warehouses and turning them into homeless shelters. I went to protests in Sydney. I also went to meetings in places like Hawaii and Italy, where again these social movements would appear and they would be sort of bouncing back against sort of a globalisation narrative that was driven by neoliberalism. But one of the places I ended up for a bunch of reasons, which happened to coincide with my research, was a little island called Bougainville off the coast of Papua New Guinea. It's just sort of, I suppose, northeast of the Papua New Guinean mainland. Ethnically, it should be part of the Solomon Islands, but with most of the things that happened in a post-colonial era, they ended up being part of Papua New Guinea, which made no sense. So you have this like distinct different group called Bougainville, and they're part of Papua New Guinea. Now, this is a really interesting, fascinating and kind of tragic story. For various reasons, a civil war started, and for those of you who are interested in that region, the civil war has got to do a lot with a mine, the Panguna copper mine, that ended up creating environmental havoc, and ended up being we saw protests and then eventually armed conflict trying to close down the mine. What was really interesting was that it was a civil war that saw people that were neighbours going from working together to then actually fighting against each other. So, like most civil wars, it was incredibly brutal, incredibly heartbreaking, and no, obviously there was never going to be a clear winner. I arrived there because my background is actually in finance, and I was there to act as a bit of a consultant to see how the economy could rebuild as they were coming out of the space of conflict. I arrived there at that time, having a financial background. At the same time, I was asked to write some stuff about some human rights abuses that had happened from some human rights organisations that I knew. And then the third reason I was there was to actually continue my research. And I wanted to see if there was something in this movement that was actually kind of that was worth noting, and linked it to to any other movements around the world, because there was a movement both that tried to stop the mine, but also there was a movement, a counter movement for peace as well. So there was multiple things happening there, and I was wondering, is there a theme that's happening in this sort of very small island in this tiny part of the world that actually links it to what was happening globally?